The park was peaceful, just birdsong, morning light, and a 72-year-old man in a pressed coat feeding sparrows by the river. Then Officer Ryan Caldwell raised his hand and brought it down across Harold Cross's face. One slap, that's all it took. Caldwell thought he was disciplining a vagrant. He didn't know he was starting a war. He didn't know who Harold Cross was. And by the time he found out, his badge was gone, his freedom was gone, and his name belonged to the very community he despised. The morning came in softly over Maple Landing, the way it always did in late October. Pale gold light filtering through the oak trees, the river catching it in long silver ribbons, the air carrying that particular cold that didn't bite yet, but promised to. Harold Cross arrived at the park at 7:15, same as always. He came on foot, 3 blocks from the house on Sycamore Street, walking at a pace that was unhurried, but deliberate. A man who had nowhere to be, and had earned that fact. He was dressed the way he always dressed. Charcoal overcoat, pressed collar, dark slacks with a crease sharp enough to draw blood. His shoes were polished to a mirror finish that caught the light off the river. To anyone passing, he looked like a retired professor, or perhaps a judge, taking the morning air before the world woke up and made its demands. He carried a small paper bag in his left hand. Premium seed mix, sunflower hearts, millet, safflower. He didn't buy the cheap stuff. The birds deserved better than that. He settled onto the iron bench at the far end of the path, the one closest to the water, and opened the bag with the careful, methodical movements of a man who had learned long ago that slowness was its own kind of power. For 31 years, those same hands had gripped steering wheels in pursuit, pressed against wounds, signed warrants, and steadied weapons in the dark. Now they scattered birdseed across a stone path, and that, Harold had decided, was the better use. They came quickly. They always did. 2 sparrows first, then a fat mourning dove that Harold privately considered a freeloader. Then the one he had been waiting for, a northern cardinal, brilliant red against the dull morning, landing precisely at the toe of Harold's left shoe as if they had an appointment. Harold watched it eat, his eyes dark and still, softened in a way they rarely did in front of other people. He didn't hear the footsteps until they were close. Heavy, deliberate, the particular rhythm of someone who wanted to be heard. The shadow fell across the bench before the man did. Officer Ryan Caldwell was 26 years old and built like someone who had peaked in high school and was still angry about everything that came after. His uniform was immaculate in the way of a man who had nothing else to take pride in. His jaw was set, his hand already drifting toward his belt, and his eyes, pale, flat, scanning, had already made their decision before his mouth opened. "You need to move along," Caldwell said. Not a question, not even really a command, a dismissal. Harold finished brushing the seed from his palm before he looked up. "Good morning, officer." "I said move along. You can't loiter here." Harold looked around the empty park slowly, the way a man does when he wants the other person to hear how foolish they sound. "I'm feeding birds, son. That's what this bench is for." "Don't call me son." Caldwell stepped closer, his weight shifting forward, all of it wrong, too eager, too tight. "I've had complaints about vagrancy in this area. You got ID? I live on Sycamore Street." Harold's voice was level. Not warm, but not raised. The voice of a man who has given orders in burning buildings. 412, 3 blocks that way. I'm a retired civil servant, and I am sitting on a public bench on a Tuesday morning. ID, I know. Harold looked at him for a long moment. He assessed the stance, the breathing, the particular brand of fear that wore aggression like a costume. He had arrested men like this. He had also buried them. "I'm going to reach into my coat pocket," Harold said, narrating his movements the way 30 years of survival had taught him to. Slowly. Left side. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Caldwell's voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. He reached out and grabbed Harold's wrist. Harold looked down at the hand on his wrist, then up at Caldwell's face. "Remove your hand," he said quietly. "You have no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, and no legal basis for this stop. Remove your hand." What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Caldwell's face twisted, not with rage exactly, but with something uglier, something that had been coiled inside him looking for a place to land. His right hand came up and across in a sharp, open-palmed strike that caught Harold across the left cheek with a sound that scattered every bird in the clearing at once. The park went absolutely silent. Harold did not fall. He did not stumble. He stood exactly as he had been standing, shoulders square, spine straight, one hand still at his side. A thin line of red appeared at the corner of his mouth, where his lip had caught his own tooth. He looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked back, his chest heaving, his hand still raised, eyes suddenly seeming to understand, in the way that a man understands a car accident the moment before impact, that something had just gone permanently, catastrophically wrong. Harold said nothing. He didn't need to. The Maple Landing Police Department was the kind of building that told you everything about the town that built it. Clean brick facade, polished brass lettering, American flag snapping in the October wind. The lobby smelled of fresh coffee and carpet cleaner. There were no drunks sleeping on the benches, no overworked desk sergeants drowning in paperwork. This was a suburb that prided itself on order, and the station reflected that pride the way a mirror reflects a face, faithfully, and without mercy. Caldwell brought Harold in through the side entrance, one hand gripping his arm with the possessive firmness of a man trying to convince himself he was still in control. Harold walked without resistance. He had walked into worse buildings than this. He had walked out of all of them. The booking area was quiet at this hour. A dispatcher turned at the sound of footsteps and looked up over her reading glasses. Behind the front desk sat Sergeant Donna Reeves. I'm 53 years old, 22 years on the force, a woman who had developed an instinct for trouble the way some people develop an instinct for weather. She was filling out a report when they came in. She finished the sentence she was writing before she looked up. Then she looked up. She saw the overcoat first, then the posture, then the shoes, then the thin line of dried blood at the corner of the old man's mouth. Her pen stopped moving. "They found him loitering in Riverside Park," Caldwell announced, steering Harold toward the counter. Refused to identify, resisted lawful orders, became belligerent. He said it with the practiced confidence of a man reciting a story he had already decided was true. Reeves looked at Harold. Harold looked back at her with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who had absolutely nowhere else to be and knew exactly how this ended. "Your name, sir?" Reeves asked. "Go Harold Cross." His voice filled the room the way a voice does when it was built to fill much larger ones. Reeves wrote the name. Then her hand slowed. She looked at the letters she had just written, as though they had rearranged themselves into something unexpected. Her head came up slowly. "Harold Cross," she repeated. Not a question. Something else entirely. "That's correct, Sergeant." She looked at Caldwell, then back at Harold. "Where are you from, Mr. Cross?" "Baltimore. Retired 3 years ago." A pause. 31 years with the department. Last posting was Chief of the Eastern District." The dispatcher in the corner stopped pretending to work. Reeves set her pen down on the desk with the careful precision of someone buying themselves 3 seconds to think. She stood up. "Officer Caldwell," she said, her voice dropping to a register that contained no warmth whatsoever. "What exactly is the charge?" "Loitering. Resisting." Caldwell's voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. He could feel the temperature in the room changing and couldn't understand why. "He was uncooperative and uncuff him." "Sergeant, he was—" "I won't say it again." Caldwell uncuffed him. Harold rubbed his wrists in that slow, deliberate way and said nothing, which was somehow worse than anything he could have said. What happened in the next 20 minutes happened quietly and quickly. and the way serious things tend to happen in institutional buildings. Reeves made a phone call, then another. Caldwell stood in the booking area with the particular stillness of a man watching the ground shift under his feet. The dispatcher found something urgent to do in the far corner of the room. Nobody looked at Caldwell directly, which was its own kind of verdict. Deputy Chief Stephen Morrow arrived from the back office in his shirt sleeves, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, but carrying the expression of a man whose morning had just become someone else's problem. He was 58, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular political intelligence that comes from surviving 4 different administrations in the same department. He assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds: the old man's bearing, the blood on his lip, Caldwell's rigid and desperate posture, and made a calculation. He brought both men into his office and closed the door. What he said to Harold was courteous, measured, and deeply apologetic. What he said to Caldwell, after Harold had been escorted to a private waiting room with coffee and offered use of the telephone, was considerably less so. But when the door opened again, no formal complaint had been filed. No incident report bearing the words "use of force" sat in the system. Morrow had used the word discretion several times. He had used the phrase best interests of the department at least twice. Caldwell walked out of that office still wearing his badge, still wearing his gun. Harold walked out of the station 40 minutes later into the cold morning air, his lips swollen, his wrists still faintly red. He stood on the front steps for a moment, looking out at the quiet street, the manicured hedges, the flag above the door. He reached into his coat pocket, found his phone, and checked the time. Then he put the phone away and started walking home. He already knew what Morrow didn't. Discretion wasn't a solution. It was an accelerant. And the fire, as Harold Cross knew better than most, had already started. The first sign came 3 days later, on a Thursday morning that arrived gray and indifferent. Harold came out of the front door at 7, coat buttoned, bag of birdseed in hand, and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. His car sat in the driveway the way it always did. A 1971 Buick Riviera, midnight blue, kept in the kind of condition that communicated to anyone paying attention that its owner had standards and the patience to maintain them. For Harold had bought it the year he made lieutenant. It had outlasted 2 marriages, 1 riot, and a decade of Baltimore winters without a single rust spot. Someone had taken a key to the entire driver's side. The scratch ran from the front wheel arch to the rear bumper in a single, continuous line. Unhurried, deliberate. The work of someone who wanted him to understand that they had taken their time. Harold stood at the bottom of the steps for a long moment. The cold air moved through the oak tree at the edge of the lawn, lifting the last of the leaves and carrying them across the driveway. He looked at the scratch. Then he looked at the street, quiet and still in the early morning gray. Then he went back inside, set down the birdseed, and got his phone. He photographed the car from 6 angles. He noted the time, the date, the weather conditions, the absence of any other damage. He wrote it all down in a small leather notebook he had found in the back of his desk drawer, a habit so old it had become reflex. 31 years had taught him that documentation was the only weapon that never ran out of ammunition. He did not call the police. The second sign came the following Monday. He found the note tucked under the windshield wiper of the Buick, folded once, written in block letters on plain white paper. It said, "Know your place. Next time it won't be the car." Or there was no signature. There didn't need to be. Harold read it once, turned it over, read the blank side as though confirming something, and placed it in a clear plastic freezer bag he retrieved from the kitchen. He wrote the date and time on the outside with a marker. He put it with the photographs. He began sleeping lighter after that. So not from fear, exactly. Harold Cross had not been afraid of the dark since his 30s, but from the particular alertness of a man who has been reminded that the world is not finished with him yet. He lay in the quiet of the house and listened to the street, cataloging sounds the way he once cataloged threats. The neighbor's dog, the 315 freight train 4 miles east, the particular creak of the oak tree when the wind came from the north. He mapped the sounds until he owned them. Then came the citations. They arrived by mail over the following 2 weeks, official Maple Landing municipal envelopes, each one crisp and bureaucratic and precisely designed to look routine. The first cited an overgrown hedge. Harold's hedges were trimmed to 4 inches and had been for 3 years. The second cited an improperly stored waste receptacle. His bins were exactly where the municipal code required them. The third was a noise complaint, filed at 2:17 on a Wednesday morning, alleging a disturbance at 412 Sycamore Street. Harold had been asleep at 2:17 on a Wednesday morning. He had been asleep at 2:17 on every morning of his adult life. He called the municipal office about the third one. The clerk who answered was apologetic in the vague, helpless way of someone following instructions they didn't write. The complaint had been filed by an officer R. Caldwell. Badge number 214. Harold thanked her and hung up. Now he added the citations to the folder that now lived in the locked bottom drawer of his desk, alongside the photographs and the bagged note. He had started a timeline in the leather notebook. Dates and incidents logged in his careful, small handwriting, each entry precise and unemotional, stripped of everything except fact. It looked, he thought, not unlike the case files he used to build in Baltimore, the ones that ended careers. He began varying his route to the park, not from fear, but from discipline. A man who moves predictably is a man who can be planned around, and Harold had not survived 3 decades in violent precincts by being predictable. He started leaving the house at different times, using the back door some mornings, taking the long way down Elm and cutting through the church parking lot. Small adjustments, the kind that cost nothing and might matter everything. One evening, and sitting at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of him and the leather notebook beside it, Harold added up everything he had. 7 photographs, 1 physical threat in a sealed evidence bag, 3 fraudulent citations with the filing officer's name on every single one, a documented pattern spread across 18 days. He looked at what he had built and felt something settle in his chest. Not anger, not satisfaction exactly. Something older and more deliberate than either. He closed the notebook, put the folder away, and locked the drawer. Then he picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not dialed in 2 years. It rang 3 times before the voice on the other end answered, careful and measured even at this hour. "Adrian," Harold said, "I need you to come home." Adrian Cross arrived on a Friday evening in a rented black sedan that he parked with the front wheels exactly parallel to the curb. Harold watched from the front window as his son stepped out, straightened his jacket with a single downward pull, and stood for a moment surveying the street with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who was never simply arriving anywhere. He was always assessing first. He was 34 years old and carried himself like a man a decade older. Lean, dark-suited, with his mother's sharp jaw and Harold's eyes, that same dark, unhurried stillness that saw everything and offered nothing back until it was ready. He had a leather bag over one shoulder and a hard-sided case in his right hand that Harold recognized immediately as the kind used for camera equipment. He had not brought a suitcase. Whatever Adrian Cross was here to do, he had decided exactly how long it would take and packed accordingly. Harold opened the door before his son reached the porch steps. They looked at each other for a moment, in the way of 2 people who have a great deal of unfinished history and have silently agreed, for now, to set it aside. "You look thin," Harold said. "You look like someone hit you," Adrian said, his eyes moving briefly to the faint remnant of bruising at the corner of Harold's mouth. "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table with coffee neither of them touched, while Harold walked through everything methodically: the park, the slap, the station, Morrow's quiet burial of the incident report, the car, the note, still in its evidence bag, the citations, the timeline in the leather notebook, which he slid across the table without comment. Adrian read it the way he read everything, without expression, turning pages with the steady deliberateness of a man who knew that the first read was for facts, and the feelings, if they came at all, came later. When Harold finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the October wind pressing against the window above the sink. Adrian closed the notebook. How long between the slap and the first act of vandalism? 3 days. He's escalating on a short cycle. Adrian set the notebook down precisely where he had found it. That means he's frightened, so not calculated. Frightened people make mistakes faster. He paused. Has anyone else witnessed any of the incidents? Mrs. Tanner across the street. She mentioned seeing a car idling outside 2 nights before I found the scratch. Didn't think much of it. Make and color? She said dark, possibly blue or black. Adrian nodded slowly, something moving behind his eyes that didn't quite reach his face. He reached into the leather bag and placed a yellow legal pad on the table. He uncapped a pen. I'm going to need everything. Every neighbor who might have a sight line to this driveway or the street. Every time you've seen or heard anything unusual in the last 3 weeks. Every name you encountered at that station, from Reeves to Morrow, and every word you remember being said. He looked up. Exact words where you can. Harold almost smiled. You sound like me. I learned from somewhere, Adrian said, and returned to the legal pad. They worked until past midnight, and Adrian filled 4 pages in a handwriting so small and precise it looked typeset. He asked questions the way surgeons make incisions, economical, targeted, without a single unnecessary movement. Harold answered with the same economy. Whatever distance lived between them in ordinary life contracted here, in the kitchen light, over the facts of a case. This was the language they had always shared best. Not warmth exactly, but rigor. And rigor, Harold had always believed, was its own form of love. The next morning, Adrian was up before Harold. By the time Harold came downstairs at 6:30, his son had already mounted 2 small weatherproof cameras at the front corners of the house, their lenses angled to cover the driveway, the front walk, and a substantial portion of the street in both directions. A third camera, barely larger than a shirt button, sat above the front door, invisible unless you were looking for it specifically and knew exactly what you were looking for. Adrian was at the kitchen table with his laptop open, the hard-sided case open beside him, a tangle of small drives and cables arranged with characteristic neatness. He had also, Harold noticed, retrieved the evidence bag from the locked drawer, the folder of photographs, and the citations, and had arranged them across the far end of the table in chronological order. The whole thing looked, Harold thought, less like a kitchen and more like a command post. The note may have partial prints, Adrian said without looking up. I know someone at the State Forensics Lab. It won't be official, but it'll tell us what we have. He turned a page. I also pulled Caldwell's public record last night. 3 use-of-force complaints in 4 years. All 3 closed without findings. Harold poured his coffee. Buried? Buried, Adrian confirmed. He finally looked up, and for just a moment something crossed his face that wasn't professional, something that was simply a son, sitting in his father's kitchen, looking at a bruise that had no business being there. It passed quickly. He has a pattern, Adrian said. We just have to make it visible. Harold sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around his mug. Outside, the morning was coming in slow and gray over Maple Landing, the oak tree moving in the early wind, and the street still and quiet and entirely unaware of what was being built at the kitchen table on Sycamore Street. Then let's build the case, Harold said. Adrian uncapped his pen. The rain came in on Saturday and stayed through the weekend, gray and relentless, turning the oak leaves on Sycamore Street into a dark, wet carpet across the lawn. Adrian didn't seem to notice. He had converted the dining room into something that would have unsettled anyone who didn't understand the work. 3 laptops open at different angles, a corkboard borrowed from Harold's study now mounted against the wall, documents pinned in expanding clusters connected by thin lines of red thread. And Harold looked at it once from the doorway, recognized the architecture of it, and left his son to it without comment. By Sunday morning, Adrian had pulled everything the public record would give him on Officer Ryan Caldwell. It wasn't nothing. The first use of force complaint had been filed 18 months into Caldwell's tenure by a man named Dennis Tate, 41, a postal worker who had been stopped while walking to his car after a late shift. Tate alleged he had been thrown against a wall and kneed twice in the lower back after asking why he was being detained. The internal affairs file, which Adrian had obtained through a public records request, submitted at 11:17 the previous night, with the particular efficiency of a man who knew exactly which forms to file and in which order, showed the complaint had been reviewed by a Sergeant R. Okafor and closed within 9 days. Insufficient evidence. No body camera footage available. Camera malfunction. The second complaint, filed 8 months later, came from a woman named Cecilia Burns, 63, who alleged Caldwell had blocked her vehicle in a parking lot, demanded her identification without cause, and when she asked for his badge number had been told to watch her mouth. Closed in 11 days, unsubstantiated. Okafor again. The third complaint was the one that made Adrian set down his coffee and sit very still for a moment. A 16-year-old boy named Marcus Webb had filed it with the assistance of his mother 14 months ago. He alleged that Caldwell had stopped him on his bicycle 3 blocks from his school, accused him of matching a description that turned out to be for a suspect twice his age and twice his size, forced him to the ground, and held him there with a knee on his back for 6 minutes while a second officer stood watching. The second officer's name was listed in the file as P. Grisholm. Closed in 8 days. Insufficient grounds to proceed. Same signature. Adrian pinned all 3 files side by side on the corkboard and stood back and looked at them the way you look at a thing when you need to see all of it at once. 3 complaints, 3 closures, 1 reviewing sergeant, and underneath each file, like a root system beneath separate trees, the same invisible architecture of protection. He started pulling on the thread of Sergeant Okafor and found, without great difficulty, a photograph from the department's annual awards ceremony 2 years prior. Okafor stood in the 3rd row. Caldwell stood 2 places to his right. Between them, 1 hand on each man's shoulder, stood Deputy Chief Stephen Morrow. All 3 were smiling in the uncomplicated way of men who are comfortable with one another in rooms where decisions are made. Adrian added the photograph to the board. By Sunday afternoon, he had a name for what he was looking at. In the departments where Harold had spent his career, they had called it different things in different decades, but the shape of it never changed. A small, self-protecting cluster of officers who covered each other's paperwork, shared the same patterns of stops, and operated with the quiet confidence of men who had never once been made to account for themselves. In Baltimore, they had called it a brotherhood. Harold had called it a cancer. The treatments were the same regardless of the name. The stops themselves took longer to build. Adrian had submitted records requests to the municipal traffic and citation database and cross-referenced Caldwell's stop history against demographic data for each district he had worked. The numbers that came back over the following day were not surprising to either man, but were the kind of numbers that became, in the right hands, devastating. Caldwell had made 61 pedestrian stops in 30 months. 54 of them involved black residents. While of those 54, 31 had resulted in no citation, no arrest, and no documented probable cause. They were stops that existed in the record only as stops. Contacts, the department called them. Harold had another word for them. Adrian printed the numbers, added them to the board, and stepped back again. The corkboard now held 3 complaint files, a photograph, a stop record, 2 personnel files for Grisholm and Okafor, and an organizational chart of the department's chain of command with Morrow's name near the top and a series of careful notations in Adrian's small handwriting running down the margins. Harold stood in the doorway that evening, looking at it all, his coffee going cold in his hand, his eyes moving across the board the way they had once moved across crime scenes. Not searching for what was there, but for what the arrangement of things revealed. "How long has this been going on?" Harold asked. "At minimum 3 years," Adrian said. "Probably longer. These are just the people who filed." He paused. Most people don't file. Harold knew that. He had spent 31 years knowing that. He looked at the photograph of Morrow with his hands on both men's shoulders and felt the cold, familiar weight of institutional rot, the particular exhaustion of a man who had fought this his entire career and had believed, quietly and perhaps foolishly, that retirement meant he was done. We take this to the council meeting," Harold said. Adrian nodded. He had already started building the presentation. The Maple Landing Public Safety Council met on the second Tuesday of every month in the main hall of the Civic Center, a room that smelled of old wood and municipal ambition, with rows of folding chairs facing a long table, where 5 council members sat behind nameplates and glasses of water they rarely touched. On a typical evening, the agenda ran to streetlight maintenance and parking ordinance updates, and the room held perhaps 30 people, most of them there out of obligation rather than interest. On this particular Tuesday, every seat was filled before 7 o'clock. People stood along the back wall and both side aisles. The fire marshal would have had concerns. Nobody called him. Word had moved through Maple Landing the way it moves through small communities, not through any single channel, but through all of them at once, neighbor to neighbor, phone to phone, to the particular current of a town that had begun to understand that something had happened in its riverside park that it was not supposed to know about. Mrs. Tanner had told her book club. The book club had told their families. The families had told everyone else. By the time Harold and Adrian walked through the Civic Center doors at 6:55, the room had the dense, electric quality of air before a storm. Harold took a seat in the second row. He wore his charcoal overcoat and said nothing to anyone, though several people nodded at him with the careful, respectful gravity of people acknowledging a wound they hadn't known how to address. Adrian walked past the rows of chairs without stopping and set his laptop on a table to the right of the council's podium, connected an HDMI cable to the projector mounted above the room, and opened his files with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had been preparing for exactly this moment since Friday evening. Deputy Chief Morrow sat at the far end of the council table in his dress uniform, his expression arranged into something that was meant to look like calm authority, and looked instead like a man holding very still in the hope that stillness would protect him. Caldwell was not present. Adrian had expected that. The council chair, a woman named Patricia Osei, called the meeting to order and moved through the preliminary items with a briskness that suggested she understood the room and respected it enough not to waste its time. When she reached new business, she looked at Adrian and nodded. Adrian stood. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He began with the facts in the order they had occurred, laying each one down like a foundation stone. The park, the slap, the station, the buried incident report. He spoke without flourish, without editorializing, and with the precise, load-bearing clarity of someone who knew that the facts themselves were sufficient, and that anything added to them would only diminish what they carried. The room, which had been murmuring when he started, went progressively quieter as he spoke, the silence deepening with each fact, the way water deepens as you move from shore. Then he turned to the projector. The first piece of footage came from the Civic Center parking lot camera, city property, a public record, obtained through a formal request submitted 6 days prior. It showed Caldwell's personal vehicle, dark blue, the plate number clearly visible, parked on the street adjacent to Harold's block at 2:41 on the morning the scratch appeared on the Buick. The timestamp burned in the lower right corner of the frame in white numerals that left no interpretive room whatsoever. The vehicle sat. The vehicle did not move for 22 minutes. Then it left, and someone in the back row said something quiet and profane. Nobody told them to stop. The second piece of footage came from Adrian's own camera, the one mounted at the corner of the house on Sycamore Street, and it showed Caldwell's vehicle making a slow pass in front of the house on 3 separate nights across 2 weeks, each pass documented with date, time, and plate. Adrian played all 3 consecutively without comment. He didn't need to comment. Then he presented the complaints, and he put Dennis Tate's file on the screen and read the key passages aloud in the same unvarying tone. Then Cecilia Burns. Then Marcus Webb. And when the photograph of 16-year-old Marcus appeared alongside his written statement, the room shifted in a way that was almost physical, a collective intake of breath that changed the air pressure in the hall. He showed the stop data last. The numbers sat on the screen in plain black type against a white background, and they were the most devastating thing in the presentation precisely because they required no interpretation. 54 stops, 31 with no basis, 3 years, the same officer, the same pattern. Every time. Patricia Osei had stopped writing on her notepad. She was looking at the screen with an expression that had moved beyond professional concern into something more personal and more unforgiving. Adrian closed his laptop. "We are not here to allege misconduct," he said. "We are here to present a documented pattern and ask this council what it intends to do about it." The room stayed quiet for 3 full seconds after he sat down. Then it didn't. 2 council members spoke at once. 3 residents stood up without being recognized. Morrow leaned forward to say something into the microphone and was spoken over by a man in the 3rd row who had apparently been waiting a long time to say what he said. Patricia Osei let it run for 90 seconds before she brought her gavel down 4 times and restored enough order to proceed. The vote to suspend Caldwell pending a full internal affairs investigation passed 4-1. Morrow cast the single dissenting vote, which the room noted and which the local reporter in the back row wrote down in full. Harold sat through all of it with his hands folded in his lap and his posture unchanged. When it was over, he did not move immediately. He waited until most of the room had cleared, then stood, buttoned his coat, and walked to where Adrian was packing his laptop. He put a hand briefly on his son's shoulder. Adrian stilled. "Good work," Harold said. 2 words, quietly delivered. But from Harold Cross, they carried the full weight of everything he had never found easy to say, and Adrian received them accordingly. They walked out into the cold night together, father and son, the civic center lights going off behind them one by one, and neither of them said what they both already knew, that Caldwell had just watched everything he had left get taken from him, and that a man with nothing left was the most dangerous creature alive. The termination letter arrived at Ryan Caldwell's apartment on a Wednesday morning by certified mail, which meant he had to sign for it, which meant he had to open the door, which meant the neighbor across the hall saw his face when he read it. He wished later that he had not opened the door. He wished later a great many things that no longer had any practical application. The letter was 4 paragraphs. The first stated the department's decision. The second cited the grounds: conduct unbecoming, pattern of biased enforcement, falsification of citation records. The third outlined the terms of his separation, including the suspension of his pension pending the outcome of the internal affairs investigation. The fourth informed him of his right to appeal through the union, though the union he had already discovered in 2 unreturned phone calls and 1 conversation that ended faster than it began. Anand was in the process of deciding how much distance it needed to put between itself and Officer Ryan Caldwell. He read the letter twice, standing in the doorway in his undershirt. Then he closed the door and sat down on the couch and stayed there for a long time, while the morning light moved across the floor of the apartment, and the refrigerator hummed, and the world outside continued without any apparent awareness that something had ended. That by evening he had made a significant dent in a bottle of bourbon that had been 3/4 full at noon. He told himself in those first days that it was temporary, that the appeal would reverse it, that Morrow would intervene, would remember what loyalty meant, would make some call to some person and restore the natural order of things. He left 2 more messages for Morrow that were not returned. He drove past the station on a Thursday afternoon and sat in his car across the street, watching officers he had worked beside for 4 years walk in and out of the building he could no longer enter, and felt something in his chest that started as anger and curdled over the course of that hour into something colder and less navigable. He stopped shaving sometime in the 2nd week. He stopped answering his mother's calls sometime in the 3rd. The bourbon was replaced by whatever was cheapest and available, and the apartment, which had never been particularly warm, took on the specific quality of a place where someone had stopped caring what it felt like to live there. But Caldwell was not, even now, entirely passive in his deterioration. Rage in certain people functions as a kind of architecture. It provides structure when everything else has collapsed, gives the days a shape and a purpose and a direction to point in. For Caldwell's rage pointed, as it always had, toward the man on Sycamore Street. He began driving past the house at night. Not every night at first, and then every night, and then sometimes twice. Once before midnight, and once in the hours after. The bourbon riding warm in his blood. The dark street sliding past his window while he catalogued the lights in the windows and told himself he was simply watching, simply keeping track, or that this was information. And information was power, and power was the only thing that had ever made him feel like himself. He sent the first anonymous message through a disposable email account created at the public library 3 towns over, because even now, some operational instinct survived the bourbon. It said what the note on the windshield had said, more or less, though the language was worse and the specific details, the model of Harold's car, the time he typically left for the park, or the description of the front door, were meant to communicate that the distance between the writer and the recipient was smaller than the recipient might prefer to believe. Adrian flagged it within 6 hours, traced the library terminal within 48, and added it to the file without telling Harold until he had decided how to tell him. He told him over breakfast on a Sunday, setting the printed email on the table beside Harold's coffee with the careful, neutral delivery of someone delivering a clinical finding rather than a threat. Harold read it, turned it over, read the blank side in that way he had, and set it down. "He's collapsing," Harold said. "Yes," Adrian said, "but collapse isn't the same as finished." Harold looked at his son across the table. "I know," he said quietly. "I know exactly what collapse looks like in a man like that." He did know. He had spent 31 years in a city full of men who had collapsed in exactly this way, and men who had been reduced by failure or humiliation or loss to their most basic and most dangerous element. Men who had stopped calculating consequences because consequences require a future, and a collapsing man has already decided he has none. He knew the trajectory of it. He knew where it ended. That night, Harold unlocked the cabinet in his bedroom closet and checked his service weapon for the first time since moving to Maple Landing. He cleared it, inspected it, reloaded it with the practiced, unhurried movements of 31 years of muscle memory, and placed it on the nightstand, within reach. He did not sleep heavily after that. He lay in the dark, listening to the street, to the oak tree, to the sound of the neighborhood breathing around him. And he waited with the patience of a man who had learned that certain storms could not be outrun or redirected, only met, when they arrived, with everything you had left. The storm arrived from the northwest on a Thursday night, the kind that announces itself hours before it lands. A pressure change in the air, a particular stillness in the trees, the sky going the color of a bruise above the rooflines of Maple Landing. Harold noticed it at dusk when he walked to the end of the porch and stood for a moment looking at the horizon. He went back inside and locked the door with the deadbolt and the chain. And Adrian had driven to the county courthouse that afternoon to file the latest addition to the civil complaint, and had called at 7 to say he would stay over rather than drive back in the weather. Harold told him the roads were fine. Adrian said he would be back by 9. They both understood, without saying it plainly, that neither of them wanted Harold alone in the house tonight. At 8:47, the first serious rain came down, not gradually, but all at once, as though a decision had been made. The oak tree on the front lawn bent, and recovered, and bent again. The motion sensor light above the garage fired on and off as debris moved across the driveway. Harold sat in the armchair in the front room, facing the hallway that led to the kitchen, his service weapon on the side table to his right, the safety off. The lamp beside him was off. The room was dark except for the pale, intermittent light that came through the window when the sensor fired. He had called Adrian at 9:15 to tell him to wait out the storm when the camera alert came through on his phone. It was the side yard camera, the one mounted at the corner of the house that covered the narrow passage between the property and the neighbor's fence. The alert was motion, and the motion was not debris. Harold looked at the screen and saw a figure moving along the fence line in a low, deliberate crouch, one hand against the fence for guidance, and the other held close to the body in the way of someone carrying something they did not want to swing freely. Harold set the phone down, picked up the cig, and stood. He did not turn on any lights. He knew the house the way he had learned to know every environment he had ever been responsible for, by dark, by sound, by the particular geography of shadows. He moved from the front room into the hallway and positioned himself at the kitchen doorway, his back against the wall, the hallway covering him on the left, the kitchen entrance visible on the right. He controlled his breathing in the old way, in through the nose, out slow, heart rate dropping despite everything telling it to rise. The kitchen window went first. Not the glass. Caldwell used the butt of the handgun against the frame latch and forced it upward, with a sound that was half crack and half groan, and swallowed almost entirely by the thunder that arrived at precisely that moment, as though the storm were providing cover. Then the sound of a body coming through the window, boots meeting the kitchen tile, the particular wet boot sound of someone who had crossed a soaked lawn. The breathing in the kitchen was ragged and bourbon-soaked, and Harold could hear it from the hallway clearly enough to make his assessment. Intoxicated, frightened beneath the rage, moving without a plan beyond arrival. Cross. Caldwell's voice came out cracked and too loud, a man trying to fill the dark with sound because the dark was frightening him. Cross, I know you're here. Harold said nothing. He waited. A drawer opened in the kitchen, silverware shifting. Caldwell looking for something, or just needing to move, needing to touch things. A chair scraped, then footsteps, slow and uneven, moving toward the kitchen doorway. Harold tracked them by sound, adjusting his position by inches, his shoulder blades against the wall, the cig raised and level at the height of a man's center mass. Caldwell came through the doorway. He came through fast and turned the wrong way first, toward the front room, and in the half-second that his back was partially angled. Harold moved. He closed the distance in 3 steps, his left hand coming up and over Caldwell's gun arm at the wrist, driving it downward and twisting outward in the controlled, decisive movement of someone who had trained this response until it lived below thought. The gun discharged into the floor with a sound like a thunderclap in the enclosed hallway, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the walls, plastered dust falling from the ceiling above them. Caldwell screamed and drove backward, trying to use his weight, and Harold let him come, redirecting the momentum rather than fighting it, turning with him and using the wall to check them both. He drove his forearm across the back of Caldwell's elbow against the joint. The arm bent the wrong way. The gun dropped. Caldwell folded to his knees with a sound that was more animal than human, his arm cradled against his chest, and Harold stepped back and picked up the weapon from the floor in one smooth motion, cleared it, and set it on the hallway table in the same movement. Caldwell was on the floor, hunched over his arm, his wet hair plastered to his forehead, rain still dripping from his jacket onto the hardwood. He was crying, Harold realized, not from pain alone, from the particular anguish of a man who had arrived somewhere with nothing left, and found that even here, even now, he had lost. Harold stood over him with the patience and the heaviness of a man who had seen this exact moment too many times and had never once found it satisfying. "Don't get up," Harold said. He reached into his pocket and called Adrian first. Then he called 911 and gave the address in the clear, calm voice of a man who had made that call more times than he could count, and stood in the dark hallway of his own house with his hand pressed against the wall and the storm hammering the windows, and waited for the sirens that began, within minutes, to cut through the rain. The trial lasted 11 days and was covered by outlets Harold had never heard of, alongside ones he had. The county courthouse steps became a gathering point each morning, residents of Maple Landing standing alongside people who had driven from other towns, other districts, other communities, with their own versions of the same story. Harold arrived each day at the same time, through the same entrance, wearing the same charcoal overcoat he had worn to the park on the morning that started all of it. He sat behind the prosecution table with his hands folded and his posture unchanged, and let the proceedings move around him with the stillness of a man who had already done his part, and understood that justice, at this stage, belonged to the process rather than the person. Ryan Caldwell sat at the defense table looking like a man who had aged a decade in 4 months. The arm Harold had broken had healed imperfectly, leaving him with a slight forward cant to his right shoulder that made him look permanently braced for impact. His attorney, a court-appointed defender named Gerald Fitch, who wore the expression of a man doing his professional best with the available material, had entered a plea of not guilty on the grounds of diminished capacity. The prosecution had countered with 11 exhibits, 4 witness testimonies, 2 camera recordings, and a forensic analysis of the anonymous email traced to Caldwell's library terminal, and Adrian Cross, who took the stand on the 7th day and delivered his testimony in the same unvarying, precise register he brought to everything, dismantling the diminished capacity argument with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had spent 6 weeks building the case specifically to withstand it. Sergeant Donna Reeves testified on the 8th day. She described the booking area and the bruise at the corner of Harold's mouth, Morrow's quiet management of the incident report. She used the word buried. The defense objected. The judge allowed it. Deputy Chief Morrow had retired 3 weeks before the trial began, a decision announced internally, as voluntary and understood publicly as something else entirely. He was not called as a witness. He did not attend. The jury returned their verdict on the 11th day after 6 hours of deliberation. So guilty on the charge of aggravated assault for the slap in the park, guilty on 3 counts of criminal harassment, guilty on 2 counts of filing false public records, guilty on the charge of breaking and entering with a deadly weapon, guilty on the charge of illegal discharge of a firearm within a residential dwelling. The judge, a woman named Constance Beaumont, who had the bearing of someone who had presided over a great many moments of human failing without losing her capacity to be troubled by them, sentenced Caldwell to 9 years in state prison with eligibility for parole review after 6, and a lifetime ban from law enforcement employment in any capacity, in any jurisdiction in the state. Caldwell did not look at Harold when the sentence was read. Harold did not require him to. The civil lawsuit settled 4 months later. The town of Maple Landing, its insurer, and the police union collectively produced a figure that Harold's attorney described as significant, and that Adrian, reviewing the documents at the kitchen table on Sycamore Street, described only as sufficient. Harold read the settlement agreement once, signed where indicated, and set it aside. That evening he sat in the front room in the dark for a long time with his hands in his lap and the October wind, on a full year's cycle now complete, moving through the oak tree on the front lawn. Adrian sat across from him without speaking, which was the right thing to do, and which Adrian, Harold had come to understand over these months, had always known. "I know what I want to do with it," Harold said finally. Adrian waited. There's a lot on Meridian Street, South End. The city's had it vacant for 11 years. Harold looked at the window. No youth programming south of the Civic Center? Nothing. The kids down there grow up with a very particular idea of what authority looks like and what it thinks of them. He paused. I want to change that. The groundbreaking happened in March, when the cold was still in the ground, but the light had begun to return. Harold stood at the edge of the lot on Meridian Street, with a ceremonial shovel that he used with the decisive, unsentimental efficiencies of a man who did not require ceremony to understand the significance of what he was doing. Adrian stood beside him. Mrs. Tanner was there. Dennis Tate was there. Cecilia Burns was there. Marcus Webb, 17 now and 2 inches taller than Harold remembered, stood in the front row and watched with the careful attention of someone who understood, without being told, that this was partly for him. The sign above the entrance of the finished building read, "The Caldwell Initiative, a center for youth leadership and community justice." St. Harold had chosen the name with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. People had asked him, gently and not so gently, whether it was wise, whether it was too much, whether he was sure. He had told them all the same thing. A name is only what you make of it. Caldwell had made his name into a wound. Harold intended to make it into something children would grow toward rather than away from, something the community would claim rather than mourn. The most complete form of justice he knew was not punishment. It was transformation. It was taking what had been used against you and building something with it that outlasted both the weapon and the hand that swung it. On the morning of the opening, Harold arrived early, before the crowd, and stood alone in the entrance hall for a few minutes, listening to the quiet of the new building. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small paper bag, and he walked through the back door into the courtyard where someone had planted a garden along the south wall, brown and dormant, still in the early spring, but present, waiting. He opened the bag and scattered seed along the edge of the path. Within minutes, the first sparrow arrived, then another. Harold stood and watched them eat, his hands empty at his sides. The morning light coming in soft and gold across the rooftop of the building that carried a broken man's name and had been built from his wreckage into something that would shelter and teach and endure long after every person in this story had been forgotten. He stood there until Adrian's car pulled into the lot and his son stepped out, paused, and looked at his father standing alone in the courtyard in his pressed coat and polished shoes, feeding birds in the early light. Adrian watched for a moment. Then he smiled, a small, unguarded thing that looked exactly like his father's, and walked over to stand beside him without saying a word. The birds ate. The morning held. And Harold Cross, who had asked for nothing more than this a year ago, finally, completely, had it back. Somewhere right now, there is a Harold on a bench. There is an Adrian driving back to a father he never stopped loving. There is a Marcus Webb standing in the front row of a room that was built because someone refused to be erased. Like this video, so more people find these stories. Share it with someone who needs to know that dignity wins. That patience is a weapon. That the most devastating thing you can do to hatred is outlast it and build something beautiful on the ground where it fell. Subscribe, because Harold's story is not the only one. There are more, and every single one of them matters.